And we're delighted to have with us representatives from the Diverse Corn Belt Project this month to discuss the project itself and the progress that they've made thus far. Logistically speaking, do want to state this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted to YouTube. I think we've been running about a 3-month turnaround right now, which is impressive, but at the same time, they eventually get up there, and anyone who registered for this webinar will get an email stating that it's up when it does go up. There will be a poll as soon as Emily and Lauren are done speaking, and I encourage you to fill that out. I'll make an announcement. And then we do have the ability to unmute, so please be judicious with that. We'll open it up for questions at the end. If you have any questions in the meantime, throw them in the chat and I'll be sure and ask for you. That should cover it. Emily, Lauren, take it away. Thanks for being here.
All right. Thank you, Hans. Well, like Hans said, my name is Emily Usher, and I'm the project manager for the Diverse Corn Belt Project out of Purdue University. And today, Dr. Lauren Aspreuth, who is our postdoc, and I will be sharing an overview about the Diverse Corn Belt Project and giving you some updates about what we've been doing over the past couple of years. So just to kind of set the stage, for a lot of reasons, we believe that farming in the Corn Belt will change, is changing, and needs to change. And we're talking about economics, biologically, socially, environmentally. And these suggestions of increasing crop diversity and livestock on Corn Belt farms has the potential to lead to better outcomes for individual farmers, farming and rural communities, as well as the ecological systems that we rely on. So in 2022, generally speaking, the Corn Belt farmers, and when we say Corn Belt, we mean farmers in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, produced a lot of corn and soybeans on a lot of acres, and they made a lot of money. But then we kind of juxtapose that information with some more information about increasing farmer bankruptcies, declining farmer employment, diminishing rural communities, and continued environmental degradation. And then add on top of that, sort of global geopolitical unrest, lingering effects of the pandemic's disruption, and a changing climate. It sort of poses additional threats to our current paradigm. So these struggles sort of expose a lack of resilience, persistent failure, and diminishing returns of an agricultural system that is based on monocultures. So evidence suggests that solutions can include shifting agricultural systems towards a greater diversity on farms, on the landscape, and in agricultural markets. And evidence also highlights the need for a systematic analysis that assesses pathways towards resilient intensification at both the farm, the landscape, and market levels. So the Diverse Corn Belt Project will generate evidence-based visions and frameworks to inform a more diverse and dominant system. And this transformed system will be capable of overcoming persistent market and policy barriers to support the transition to a resilient intensification and a more economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable system. So this figure that you're seeing here is sort of a quick and dirty explanation of like what we mean when we are talking about these different levels of diversification. So at the farm level, we're talking about individuals on individual farms. So these are farmers making decisions about their operation. And what we're sort of exploring are different diversified agricultural systems that can be implemented. So incorporating small grains or forage crops into rotations, so that's extended rotations, and also including perennial forage or perennial bioenergy crops into those rotations, implementing agroforestry practices, growing horticultural food crops, as well as integrating livestock onto cropland. And then at the market level, we're talking about diversifying markets and for producers as well as consumers and addressing the diverse needs of people across that value chain. And then at the landscape level, we're exploring sort of wide scale adoption of these farming systems that are climate smart, that reach profit and yield goals, as well as ecosystem services, and then ensuring that these systems and services are equally distributed across the landscape. So today we'll give you a broad overview of diverse Corn Belt objectives, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the work that we've done, so some of the progress that we've had. And just generally speaking, the diverse Corn Belt is a large project, and we have big aspirations. And we're asking tough questions, and we might get tough answers. But at the end of the day, the Diverse Corn Belt project is not trying to sort of change the landscape in 5 years, which this is a 5-year project. We're finishing up year 2. But what we are trying to do is advance the conversation about diversification and explore what diversification can look like in the Midwest and across the Corn Belt. So here's our plan. And sort of when we think about making any kind of change or plan, whether that's an individual or a family, making these decisions, there's common steps that we all kind of go through. And we're kind of trying to follow these similar steps with the Diverse Corn Belt. So if you're thinking about where to go on vacation, this sort of first information gathering stage you'd want to do is ask people what their thoughts are. What are your budgets? Where do you want to go? What time are you available? So we want to understand what limitations they're facing and sort of their general attitudes towards going on vacation or whatever event we're discussing. So in the Diverse Corn Belt project, we've labeled that co-production, and we've divided it into sort of 3 components. And co-production in general means working together to produce knowledge. So the Diverse Corn Belt is working with people all across the agricultural value chain to inform our research. Sort of our second, the second chunk of information that Diverse Corn Belt is doing is sort of pulling all of the information from that co-production, from that first objective, pulling it all together and making informed predictions about what could happen given these changes that we've been discussing. So that is our modeling objective. And then after our modeling objective, objective 3 is looking at those objective 3 is visioning, where we will look at those predictions or models and think about which are the most desirable. So what changes do you want to see? What changes are feasible? So we call that visioning, and we'll go a little bit more into what that is in the coming slides. But we expect to gather many visions from many people about what their hopes are for the future of agriculture in the Midwest. And then finally, we have the next step is sort of exploring how to enable those visions to come true by disseminating our findings. So we plan to share findings of how existing federal, state, and local policies can impact the agricultural landscape and how future policies can encourage diversification. We'll be connecting with farmers, farm advisors, input providers, and others throughout the supply chain to share what we have learned, and that is a very critical element of the Diverse Corn Belt project. And finally, our education objective is it's important to teach the next generation of farmers, decision makers, and consumers about their understanding as we develop what could be the future of agriculture. So I am going to hand it over to Lauren to talk about these co-production elements and some of the work that she's been doing over the past couple of months.
Great, thanks, Emily. So just jumping back to that first objective, co-production, the idea there is really that we're going to collaboratively identify research questions and build relationships that we can continue to draw on for the remainder of the project. So we're in year 2 of this project now. So we're forming groups of stakeholders that represent different parts of the agricultural value chain. And like Emily talked about in these RAD teams, we're calling them Reimagining Agricultural Diversity RAD teams, and we're planning to have a couple of those teams in each state. And we're having our first one actually next week in Indiana. And that will be a time for these folks to come together and really imagine what they would like for their agricultural systems in their region, as well as contribute back to our project in terms of shaping our research activities and giving input on research plans and preliminary findings. And then secondary there is the focus groups and interviews. And so that's another part of this co-production. And that's where I've been really engaged at in my postdoctoral research. And I'm going to sort of do a deep dive into this, since this is some of the first research results that we've had in the project. We started on this right away. So essentially what we're looking at with these focus groups and interviews is what are farmer perspectives on diversification and how can we support farmers to diversify. So if we go to that next slide, so far, and we're pretty much at the end stages of collecting our data, but we've conducted 20 farmer focus groups with 100 participants over the last year. And that was with a range of different types of farmers, from just corn and soybean farmers to highly diversified vegetable farmers, sort of everything in between. And then we conducted 31, actually I think it's going to be 32 tomorrow, farmer interviews. And that was specifically with diversified farmers. We really wanted to delve into the specifics of diversified farmers and how we can support them. And like Emily mentioned, that diversified farmers included horticulture, grazed livestock, extended rotations, perennials, and agroforestry, which is how we define diversification in the DCB project. So the main question that we asked farmers is, what are the benefits, challenges, and opportunities for diversification in the Corn Belt? And we're conducting that analysis using, it's qualitative analysis using both inductive and deductive strategies to understand the data. We haven't completely finished interviews, so that the data I'm going to present here on the interviews is preliminary, and the focus groups is pretty finalized, and we're working on some manuscripts and outputs on that. So I'm going to start off, we can go to the next slide, just talking about what farmers perceive as the benefits of diversified farming. And one of the biggest ones that was mentioned was improved soil health. And that was particularly from extended rotations, perennials, agroforestry. And so I'm going to share some farmer quotes. I think that they are able to say it better than I could. So one farmer from Illinois told us that if we can get another 40 or 50 units and then have another mode of action and release, you've got a different profile of nitrogen, right? You can get quite a bit of benefit out of that. But then there's also a biological and microbial side of it. You're getting that diversity in the soil, keeping things covered and living year round. Another farmer from Illinois, it was mostly engaged in horticultural production, said, I'm also aware a lot of annual cropping cycles take more from the soil than put it back. And I see perennials as a way to kind of reverse that trend, or at least help reverse that trend and leave the ground vital and workable for many future generations, because I don't want to take every last ounce out of what I can nutrient-wise out of the soil, just to get me through from now until the day I want to be done farming. Another commonly talked about aspect was that there was a dynamic and meaningful farming career that arose from diversified production. So a farmer from Iowa told us, so I don't know if you talk to very many cattle producers, but they always say feeding cattle is like a disease. I mean, you just got to do it as a farmer. I don't know, just something about it. And so I'd say the same thing about vegetables if you've been around it. You just want to do it. I don't know, it's different. I mean, it's challenging. And so if you like a good challenge. Another farmer from Iowa talked about raising pastured livestock, being that it takes a lot of time. They say, I mean, I also have 2 little kids, so it's very busy. But if I lost getting to talk to all the people all the time, I would lose a big part of what I love about what I do. We have all of these regular people and we deliver our food and we do CSA stuff in the summer with vegetable farmers. And so I have all these friends and all these customers, and people send recipes and they tell me that things are helping, the things that are helping them. And it's just very meaningful and makes the work very meaningful. Another one was improved local food access, and that was particularly around horticultural production of fruit and vegetables. One farmer from Iowa said there's a pretty robust regional local food system going on in the upper central Iowa, which didn't exist 12 years ago. So that's hopeful. And obviously, since the pandemic, there has been a number of even farms that have a few cattle here or there. They're trying to market their beef locally. Pigs is another one. Even though they're using commodity livestock, they're trying to market local just to gain a little bit more out of that dollar. So it might be less expensive than the kind of livestock that we raised, but it's still local food and it's going towards local consumers. Finally, I just wanted to mention that greater community and local food systems resilience was also talked about by farmers. A farmer from Illinois said, our rural communities are really pretty sad. And so if there were more operations that looked like ours, small scale diversified vegetables, and had people that were living in the community and invested in the community and spending money and raising kids and going to public schools versus absentee landowners for super large operations, it would look different. So kind of one of the summary conclusions that we took away is, in terms of what is it going to take to support farmers to transition to more diversified production, is really making that production system profitable and the crops and livestock easier to raise and market. And that was pretty clear across most of the folks that we spoke with. So some of the key themes that were important to farmers across all these types of diversified production to really support farmers and get there is some changes in markets, issues with scale and labor, and greater support. And so I'm going to dive into each one of these. And there's definitely more aspects that were discussed in focus groups interviews, but these were some of the most important and that were talked about across a lot of different kinds of farmers. So I'm going to talk first about markets, because that really was one of the most important things that folks brought up, is just a lack of markets. So competition from other regions that supply year-round or produce at lower cost or higher quality was a really big challenge. Also meeting buyer quality standards and just generally a lower return on investment of diversified crops and livestock. So a farmer from Indiana said, I think if there is a market for whatever we're talking about growing, whatever we're going to diversify to, we're farmers, we'll figure out a way to make it work. Whether it's equipment or fertilizers or chemicals or hiring someone with the weed zapper or whatever it is. We just want to make sure that we have a chance of profitability before we plant it. So I thought that was good, sort of summarizing generally the need for a profitable marketplace before taking that risk. Some of the opportunities that farmers identified around markets were alternative marketing arrangements like food hubs, aggregators, direct-to-market sales, also greater investment in research and development and processing, and then also, identifying that growing demand for locally produced food, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to read another quote from a farmer from Illinois who said that, we're referencing the pandemic. We saw that especially during the pandemic when our local small town grocery store suddenly could not get fresh produce or fresh vegetables or eggs to stock the shelves. All of a sudden our phone is ringing off the hook because people were like, oh yeah, those people down the road, they have eggs that they sell at the farm market. I wonder if they could have produce. And so it really brought to light the fact that we need more diversified growers to be able to support their local communities in a time of crisis. Another important issue was scale. So a lot of the folks that we spoke with, especially horticulture growers, were more smaller scale, or the ones that were growing had extended rotations and were growing something like a small grain, were doing it on lesser acreage than their corn and soybeans. And so they had issues generating the volume of product they really needed to secure contracts. And another issue was that they weren't benefiting from economies of scale. So in terms of input purchases, as well as securing contracts and marketing options. So a farmer from Indiana kind of summed this up well in terms of the economies of scale issue when they said, why did farms get bigger? If you buy 100 bags of seed corn, your price is $200 a bag. If you buy 1,000 bags of seed corn, your price is $150 a bag. Everything in the industry favors scale. And again, it starts at the top, because just because it's a lot easier, again, for Cargill, the Andersons, ADM, to call up one farmer to buy 1,000 bushels of grain, as opposed to calling 100 farmers to buy 1,000 bushels. It's easier if you're a bigger operator, period. So some of the opportunities that farmers mentioned was aggregation, like food hubs and co-ops that are able to aggregate material across different farms and sell that at more of a wholesale. Also farmer cooperation in terms of sharing equipment, machinery, cold storage, things like that. Supporting more mid-sized horticultural operations, growing markets and supports to incentivize farmers to replace more corn and soybean acreage with alternative row crops. And get those acres up to capture some of those economies of scale. And then also equipment for smaller scale and horticultural production. And this picture over here on the right is with a farmer we interviewed in Illinois, and that's with some of her smaller scale equipment on her fruit and veggie operation. Another really important one, especially in today's economy, is labor. So most farmers mention labor as being an issue for them, whether or not they were small scale, diversified, large scale, cash grain. So finding workers to staff farms was really difficult. Also for diversified production, there's a greater labor intensity and management needs for diversified operations. So a farmer from Illinois said, we do a retail sweet corn stand. So we're selling direct to consumer. You got to become an expert on everything. And I actually pulled away from some of that because now as I've gotten older, and this is probably the biggest thing, is if you're small, it's all hard physical labor. It's not done sitting in a tractor with GPS. And I don't know anybody in America that loves to say, oh, well, let's do the job that's harder versus the job that's easier. I suppose if you figure revenue is about the same. Some of the opportunities, and there's a lot that we could discuss here, but one that was brought up by farmers was, bringing more farmers back to the land in terms of younger generations, next generations, beginning farmers. I think this is my last one I wanted to mention also is support. So generally diversified farmers that are growing not very common, non-commodity crops like fruit and vegetables, oil seeds, small grains, things like that, just don't have the same kind of support that those corn and bean farmers get. So there were challenges with lack of crop insurance availability for the crops they want to grow or they are growing, crop insurance requirements that make it difficult to produce the way that they want to produce and with the kinds of crops they want to grow, lack of access to loans, grants, and cost share, as well as lack of technical support. So one farmer from Illinois said, government farm policy has pushed us away from diversification and into highly specialized, good at one crops. Some of the opportunities around here, and there's quite a few, are expanding crop insurance to include more crops and different kinds of crops, creating crop insurance premium discounts or tax credits for those who choose to diversify, better crop insurance policies and lending options for those smaller scale diversified operations, expanding crop cost share to include perennials and agroforestry, which folks talked about as being unavailable or really difficult to access. And then finally, how-to guides and business cases on getting started with diversified production. And so this quote over here on the right, the last one I'm going to read, I think really sums up that farmers want to do the right thing. They just need more information and guidance on how to do it in terms of taking care of soil and water and doing that through more diversified production. So this farmer said, I want to make a good product for everyone to consume and eat and feed. There's days where I have to question, are we even doing the right thing? I just want someone to tell us what we should be doing. I'm very good at following directions. I don't want to be part of doing something wrong or whatever, but the media, the information we're given sometimes seems conflicting. And that's all for me in terms of focus groups, interviews, deep dives. So I think I'm gonna turn it back over to Emily to go back into our project overview and going through some of these other steps.
Great, thanks, Lauren. So that was a really great overview of some of the sort of the social work that we've been working on. So doing lots of interviews, engaging with people and learning about their thoughts about diversification. So the second co-production element is on-farm research. So on-farm research, we have a variety of on-farm researchers who will be gathering water quality, soils, and insect diversity, biodiversity information from both diversified and more conventional systems. So these folks will be characterizing conditions and to what extent diversification alters those indicators for sustainability. So the infield team is another team that we can kind of share a little bit more information on. And they've been out in the field this whole summer. And I think most of them are wrapping up their field season, but you might still see a few of them out there. So this on-field or on-farm research team will be identifying how diversification can shift specific components of the agro ecosystem. And they're comparing, again, biophysical processes and conventional and diversified cropping systems across our 3 I-states. So we have recruited about 35 farmers with about 90 fields that we have gathered information from across the 3 different I-states. And this is just sort of a rough map showing you that distribution. And then our sort of the distribution of the different types of systems that we're focusing on. So the C is our control or our conventional sites. So we have a little less than 10 of those. We have a lot of folks working with extended rotations and grazed livestock. We also have a few with horticultural food crops and perennial bioenergy crops. So we have a pretty good spectrum. We're lacking on agroforestry. So if anybody knows anybody with some agroforestry acres, let us know. And while organic is not a primary focus of the Diverse Corn Belt Project. We definitely recognize the importance and value of it. So we do still have quite a few organic operations in our midst. So I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview of our different teams, or the different sort of biophysical teams that we have working and collecting data in the field. So our first, we have two sort of soil teams. This first soil team is from the University of Illinois, and it's led by Dr. Andrew Margonot, who's a soil scientist there. I'm not going to go too in depth into these research questions, but these are sort of the questions that the Margonot lab out of U of I are looking at. And then we have out of Purdue, we have soil nutrient dynamics and agroecology team. And that is being led by Dr. Shalimar Armstrong, as well as Dr. Ichao Roy. And they're also another soil focused team, but they have a little bit of different research questions and really kind of looking at soils and giving them the sort of the detail and complexity that soils have. We also do have an entomology team. So this team is led by Dr. Ian Kaplan out of Purdue University, and they're exploring generally which farming practices maximize insect biodiversity. So they're out there in the field collecting insects. We also have a crop productivity team. So they're looking at sort of the vegetative productivity of different cropping systems and sort of how they impact the environment. And finally, we have our groundwater team, which is looking at the impacts, diversification's impacts on groundwater flow, quality, and recharge. And it's kind of a small picture, but that picture down there in the middle is a picture of a freshly drilled well. And the man in the red is our farmer, and he is very happy. I don't know if you can see how big his smile is, but he was happy to have that well in there, and it's a fun activity for our groundwater team. And this is out of University of Iowa. So that is sort of a general overview of our on-farm research. And then sort of the third co-production element focuses more on surveys. So this is assessing the value chain, the readiness of the value chain to diversify. So we're identifying value chain barriers that limit diversification, as well as policy supports that may facilitate change. We're exploring barriers and motivations for farmers to diversify, farm advisors to recommend diversification strategies as a viable strategy. And we're also engaging with folks in the market sector. So we're conducting surveys with farmers, CCAs, extension folks, as well as processors, retailers, wholesalers, and consumers. So the only survey that we have launched so far has been a farmer survey. So some of you may have seen this in your mailbox sometime between January and March. So the research questions that sort of guide this survey are: what are the main barriers and opportunities identified by farmers regarding agricultural diversification in the I-States? Which diversification scenarios are most appealing to farmers? And which interventions or incentives to support diversification are the most important? So with our sort of social data that Lauren shared with us, as well as biophysical data that our in-field team is gathering, as well as additional social survey data, we have a lot of information that sort of gives us an idea of where farmers are at, as well as where folks are at along the supply chain. Which sort of leads me to our modeling objective. So this modeling objective, modeling economic and ecosystem impacts of diversified landscape scenarios to establish conditions required for economic viability. This will inform evidence-based policy recommendations, as well as quantify sustainability metrics. So all of the information that we gathered from our co-production objectives will feed into this modeling objective. And models, these, farm economics, food shed, water quality, are science-based predictions that can sort of give us an idea of how those variables will be impacted in different with different future visions. So that plays very closely into our next objective, which is visioning. So Lauren kind of briefly mentioned the Reimagining Agricultural Diversity Teams, or RAD teams. And the visioning portion of this project will bring together people through those RAD teams. So during these RAD team meetings, we'll collect input on our research results. So for example, the modeling team, the modeling folks will be able to work with people in these teams to refine our research questions and really get some good feedback on these future scenarios. There'll be really interactive discussions, and we'll discuss what alternatives exist in the current system while keeping an eye to the future, and sort of identifying those trends that may impact agriculture. We will collaboratively identify all the intermediate steps that would be necessary to work towards those scenarios. And sort of one of the exciting aspects of the Diverse Corn Belt project is our focus on this type of collaborative research, which we also draw upon the knowledge and creativity of the ag stakeholders that we're hoping this project really impacts and benefits. And also, as Lauren said, our first Reimagining Agricultural Diversity team is early next week. So stay tuned for some updates on that. And now I will hand it back over to Lauren to talk about the next couple objectives.
Sure. So this next sort of column of objectives is really about making sure that our work has impact. So objective 4 is around policy guidance. And so we're hoping to develop policy guidance that's focused on achieving resilient intensification through diversified farms, landscapes, and markets. And we're hoping to disseminate that at local, state, and national levels. And so we plan to identify specifically policy changes that are needed to address the challenges that the participants have identified on the landscape and along the supply chain, both through focus groups and interviews and our RAD teams. So for example, this can include challenges with market access and subsidies for diversified crops, the need for more research and development for diversified production systems, as well as challenges with workforce training and labor availability. And that policy guidance will be directly informed by what we've learned in those earlier stages of the research co-production with participants from throughout the agricultural sector, as well as potential and existing buyers of diversified crops and livestock. And so in the final year of the project, we hope to develop and communicate these alternative policy options to federal decision makers in Washington, D.C. through invitation-only events and legislative visits. And we also will prepare more specific materials tailored to state and local governments. So, and then the final objective there, I suppose before education, is stakeholder engagement. And so we hope to engage with farmers, on-farm advisors, and supply chain stakeholders to support farm diversification and market development throughout the supply chain. So we know that there are a lot of existing organizations with information about diversified production that are already really working in this space. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we've partnered with several organizations, including Cooperative Extension, Practical Farmers of Iowa, the American Society of Agronomy, the Nature Conservancy, and the Conservation Technology Information Center that have all been really instrumental throughout this project. Stakeholder engagement is also happening in the infield and RAD teams, which are helping to shape those research questions. And so all of these collaborators will help to bring people into the project, and they'll help to disseminate our findings to farmers, farm advisors, food processors, retailers, and communities. So we plan some field days at some point next year using our on-farm research site. So you can be on the lookout for that as well.
Wonderful. And our sixth and final objective, certainly not, it is last, but it is not least, is our education objectives. So our education team is creating, piloting, and publishing educational materials for undergraduate and high school students. They're also developing a sort of Midwestern agricultural sustainable tour, or sustainable ag tour, which will be an experiential multi-institutional field course where we'll be able to take students around the Midwest to sort of see the diversity that exists and see how diversified agriculture can exist on the landscape. And generally, the education objective is there to help foster a workforce that is prepared to respond to emerging challenges and to support a diversified landscape. And when we say a workforce, we mean the next generation of farmers, the next generation of rural residents, the next generation of agricultural stakeholders, and the next really generation of consumers. So educating the next generation of people who are making decisions, making sure that they have all the information that they need to make the best decisions for them, is the objective of this team, of this education team. So with that, I do, before we sort of open things up to discussion and questions, I do want to give a shout out to this motley crew. One of the biggest, in my eyes, sort of benefits or a big asset of the Diverse Corn Belt team is that we are a very diverse group. So we have 30 plus collaborators and researchers working on this with expertise from economic modeling to social science. So we're really sort of taking a full approach to addressing this problem and trying to come up with really great, information, really great science-based information that can really be thoughtful for people to think about and help advance this conversation about diversification in the Midwest. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you for having us and letting us share our information with you all. If you scan that QR code, that will take you to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter. And if you're interested in participating in any of the RAD teams, or would just like to stay up to date on the project, that's the place to be. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to chat.
All right. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think we've got time enough for everyone to ask one question. So what have we got? I don't see anything in the chat at this point. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question for Emily or Lauren.
And if no one has any questions for us, we have questions for you. So feel free to answer those questions as well. So we're just interested in, was any of the information that we shared, mostly was any of it surprising? The information that Lauren shared, sort of with the markets and the labor, was any of that surprising or interesting to you? And I'm also interested if anybody wants to share about what their vision for the future of agriculture would be, because we're always interested in talking about it and talking with folks about it.
Hi, I have a question actually. Do you have any good recommendations for resources on how farmers could go about diversifying their operations?
Yeah, so I think that is a good question. I might actually punt that question to Hans, because I do think that Extension has quite a bit of resources. And I think that Hans might know a little bit more about that than I do.
Well, so the question, and confirm, Tara, that I'm restating it correctly, is what resources exist for anyone who want to begin diversifying their operation?
Right. Yes. And actually, I work for Extension, not necessarily in this specific subject area. I actually work as a horticulture program coordinator, but I grew up on a family farm, and they continue to farm about 3,000 acres of corn and soybean. And I am interested in this concept of diversifying and maybe changing the way that ground is farmed. And I just didn't know if you personally could recommend any good books or anything for a deep dive.
Yeah. So obviously, as an extension educator yourself, you're aware of SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. And they're probably my go-to whenever I'm trying to think about doing different things in a way that's also environmentally friendly. So their wealth of resources, they're about 3-4 years ago, there used to be a bunch of wooden flash drives that had all the SARE resources that hit, I feel like, every county or regional office in the nation. But their website also has all those resources. From a on the ground farm perspective, one of the largest barriers to adoption of new crops is the market. Where are you going to take it once you have something? And my general recommendation is, before branching out, start calling elevators, grocery stores, restaurants, and try to find somebody that's willing to accept that new crop before you ever start, with the knowledge that for some crops, particularly those that would go to grocery stores, there may be contracts involved that are going to require lawyers and other third parties that you didn't envision ahead of time existing. So I don't know, hopefully that gave a little insight.
I just
Thanks.
also want to mention, because I think it is important to identify contracts and markets available to you, but sometimes those folks will actually want a sample of the product. And so I think making sure that you can grow to, say, food grade quality standards is also important. And generally that starts with just testing out the crop, whether or not it's as a cover crop in the case of small grains, or something grown for food grade, and then sort of working your way up. So yeah, I think starting small is also can be a good strategy. I created a small grains marketing fact sheet that's available on the UW Extension OGrain website, so I can post that up as well.
And I think a lot of what we hear about sort of people wanting to explore and sort of get into that regenerative or more diversified agriculture. So there's lots of sort of like peer groups online that have lots of resources that are able to share. So I think that sort of diving into that can be a bit overwhelming because there is so much information, but that's a benefit as well. Lots of info out there. And I just want to address Allie's question at the top of the chat. So listening in from Wisconsin, how do you think this work will apply to surrounding states, which also grow a lot of corn? I think that's a great question. And I think that it would apply. There are some elements that I think would be challenging to apply, like particularly the biophysical elements, because Wisconsin does have a little bit of a different environment than the corn states. But I think a lot of the policy elements could really apply, especially if we're talking about crop insurance or sort of these federal initiatives. I think that could definitely apply to states outside of the I states. But I do think that a lot of these sort of barriers are similar. A lot of the concerns are similar. And I think a lot of the benefits that we've found could definitely be transferred and similar to other states.
Yeah, and I think, we focus on sort of those I states because that's where corn and soybean production is the most ingrained, and it's sort of been the hardest to change. But like Emily said, I think some of it's transferable. In some of the other states, there's, greater markets. For example, like going out west, there's just more markets for small grains and things like that available. So some of those issues aren't quite as prevalent. But yeah, certainly in terms of things like support and access to crop insurance and cost sharing, things like that are going to be relevant wherever you go.
Okay. I do see a lot more action in the chat. So if you haven't checked that out, do so. I don't see any new questions. So you have to deal with my ridiculousness because I have two.
All right.
And the one that always perks my ears up is your objective 5 talking about policy. And has there been any discussion or anything settled on kind of what those recommendations might be worded like, or whether it would be language that a lawmaker could pick up and propose immediately, or any detail there?
Well, so I will say, so we don't have policy recommendations sort of sussed out at this moment. So a really important, like we had mentioned, part of DCB is working with our stakeholders to make sure that we really are promoting these policies that we hope will impact them positively, make sure that we're doing that correctly. So before we sort of launch these policy recommendations, there will be quite a bit of back and forth about them and sort of thinking about the externalities related to that and how that could possibly impact. So we don't have them quite yet. But when we do develop those with our stakeholders, we're hoping to really be able to communicate the concern and communicate the value, or communicate the concerns of sort of that we've been sharing with sort of this unsustainable system, and then identifying policy levers that could enable a more diversified system or that could ease the more diversified system. So we don't quite have it sussed out yet, but we're hoping that it would be something that would be able to inform policy development in the future.
Okay, my other question is probably for Lauren. So in the farmer interviews across the 3 states, you highlighted some of the similarities amongst all of them. Have you seen any major differences in opinion or thought as you run from Indiana westward over to Iowa?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we'll have to see how we want to sort of parse that information out as we analyze the data. I think that Indiana, Illinois are actually, and Iowa are surprisingly different. And I'm from Illinois and have spent a lot of time in both states growing up. So I was surprised just spending more time doing field work in each of those states at how different it was in terms of specifically market access. I think that was sort of the biggest difference. I think Iowa and Indiana have a lot more access to smaller scale local markets for fruits and veggies than say Illinois, especially central Illinois. Livestock is different. There's just not very much livestock in central Illinois. There's much more in northern Iowa. So I think that it's gonna look, things are gonna look different, and there were different opportunities and challenges based on those, those aspects. So if we're looking at sort of like adopting, I specifically focus on small grains. That's sort of where my expertise lies. But if we're looking at adoption of small grains and there's no livestock market around that area, so there's no secondary market if they can't make a food grade quality spec, then they don't have access to that sort of backup market. So I think that changes based on where livestock is prevalent. And I think that closeness to markets like Chicago and Indianapolis are helpful for finding markets for horticultural products, and that was sort of a little less prevalent in Iowa. So I do think that there are differences, and I think we'll have to sort of assess those. But I do also think that market access was a challenge sort of no matter where you went, and that generally having access to the sort of support that is needed, both in terms of technical support, monetary support, things like that was across the board.
Makes sense. Thank you. I don't see any additional questions. So, well, somebody unmuted for a minute. We almost had a question. Ashley.
Hi, Hans. Yes, it is me. So I just wanted to just say thank you for this presentation. It helps me understand kind of where the Diverse Corn Belt Project is going. And I just wanted to add a thought that I think there are a lot of farmers out there that really want to diversify, and the market aspect is holding them back. So there's a lot of interest and excitement about trying new crops. And unless somebody is really enterprising and can vertically integrate in some way or can market their own grain, kind of like we've been talking about on this marketing side of things, then they're not going to do it. So that's why I put in the chat, like the policy component, I think is huge on this project. And I'm excited to see where it goes. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, I'm curious, Ashley, like with the farmers that you work with, what do you think would be the most important support that they could receive to diversify?
It's kind of a tough question because like we've been talking about, what are some of the downstream consequences of what these policy changes could look like. But if there was better price support or a better type of insurance plan for a grower who's, let's say, trying out a small grain for the first time, which people are interested in growing oats in Indiana, but we don't even have blanket approval for crop insurance for oats in conventional agriculture. And I'm kind of talking from the organic space here a little bit, but like Brian is saying, you have to get a letter of adaptability. So you have to be working with an extension educator or someone else who can do that. And even then, it's not necessarily a 100% guarantee that you will get the price that you would want covered if you have a crop failure. So if there's some type of support like that, that's more comprehensive from a crop insurance standpoint. And then I'm just wondering, like in Illinois, there's mills like Janie's Mill that buys organic grains in the food grade market. And I think Ohio, even though Ohio is not part of this project, Ohio has a little bit of that as well. And we don't really have a lot of that in Indiana. And I don't know if there might be some type of policy support out there to support these kind of medium scale buyers of different types of grains. And I think, again, some of there's downstream and consequences, and there's some like hand of the market stuff going on there that I don't really have a ton of control over, but somebody's interested in starting a mill, what kind of support could they receive from a government entity to make starting that business easier or less risky, something like that. So I'm just kind of like talking now, but
Sure.
that's just thoughts that run through my head kind of on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right on. I think in terms of supporting equipment purchases, and I think that could maybe include things like mills, are becoming more common. I think Minnesota just implemented a program that supports farmers to purchase more equipment for diversified production. Yeah, crop insurance, definitely a huge one. Whole farm revenue insurance does cover the entire system, no matter what. You probably heard farmers complain about it, but I think that that's supposed to be improved in the next farm bill. But yeah, custom crop insurance agreements for crops that aren't normally covered, streamline that would be important too. Yeah, thanks for that.
And I do just want to say, Ashley, like I think what you mentioned, we're also hearing that farmers are open to diversification, but it is just a market access element. So I think you're spot on with that. And our findings are also supporting that as well. So yeah, if anybody wants to keep up to date on Diverse Corn Belt, we have a newsletter coming out very soon, so you can scan that QR code and get on that. And our website is updated occasionally, and can keep everybody up to date on what we're up to and where we're at and where we're going.
All right. Well, I thank you, Lauren and Emily, Ashley, and everyone else that participated today. Good session, and I'm going to give some time back to you all. No need to hang out until the top of the hour, unless you really just want to chat, in which case I'll stop recording and we can chat.